Partly, Harry, said Cecilia patiently. Consider what you know about the particle theory of matter. Do you remember what I said? Harry was sitting, head bent over one of Cecilia's own textbooks, looking at the relationship between water and steam. Their session often spilled back over to the fundamentals of science, and as much as Cecilia enjoyed teaching it, she was aware that Harry was probably feigning interest to avoid difficult questions. It wasn't as they all had got better things to do. It was Friday night after all, and Cecilia would have much preferred to be in her room, preparing for the visit to Nick. However, the information was vital. If she didn't get it beforehand, it would probably be a waste of time. And I'm sure Harry would much prefer to be doing something other than this. He certainly didn't look like he was enjoying it. Like when you're standing near your friends? So, the particles move further apart, because they vibrate more, and have more energy. Like you and your friends would do on a hot summer's day. Yes, well remembered. And on a cold day, you'd want to stand near your friends to keep the warmth in. She turned over a page, and sketched a diagram. Harry smiled wanly and shuffled about on the bench. How does that relate to the spell then? Does the light have particles? He looked up at her, curiously. I have to admit, Harry, that is a very advanced question. Cecilia smiled, considering how her skill would hold up to describing quantum physics. No. Perhaps not. Why do you think that? She asked. Well, you said things are made of particles, and light is a thing, so it has to have particles, he began. But it's not really a thing. He stopped. I'm just being stupid, aren't I? Cecilia got to her feet. It had been a long day, and it appeared that Harry was trying his best to avoid speaking to her about his family again. Not in the least, Harry. Teaching in most schools has until recently forgotten what scientists do, and what science is. Scientists make predictions and carry out tests to gather evidence in support of them, just like Professor Snape and I are doing. Have you heard of a scientist called Einstein? Harry shook his head. Amazing, thought Cecilia. She walked to the bookshelf and removed another of her old-school textbooks. He is one of the world's greatest scientists, and he asked that very question you just did, about light and particles. She opened the book to the page. Albert stared back at them. I'm sure if Ron'll lend you his scientist's encyclopedia, you'll be able to look him up for yourself, but no, Harry, you're not being stupid. Sometimes, light behaves in two completely different ways. It is a form of energy, but in the way that it interacts with matter, it does not seem to behave like energy. And now, she said, putting down the textbook next to Harry and looking over the top of her spectacles, I need you to carry on with the samples in front of you. He gave her a downcast look. There isn't really much more to do after this for tonight, Harry, she said, showing him the samples that Snape had already irradiated with Ridiculous as a control. Just that, and if you wouldn't mind having a look at the section in the book about genetic inheritance, then we can discuss what you think. Harry turned grudgingly to the dishes of gelatinous blood samples in front of him. Quite gory, he considered, despite the fact they were not inside anyone. What's going to happen to the samples, Mrs. Frobisher? I mean, what happened to them before? Oh, he noticed the dishes that sat adjacent to the ones Cecilia had directed him to aim for. So you think there might be a difference, Mrs. Frobisher? Go on, what's your prediction? Said Cecilia, as she glanced over to Harry whilst considering them carefully. The samples in front of him, those tested by Snape, had responded similarly as before. The mole sample, her own, was completely destroyed. With the squib one, the cells deformed and absorbed the spell, the energy, but did nothing. But the ones which had come from wizards had changed again, and reorganized, the cell organelles rearranging to become something else. Snape's own, Cecilia had noticed, Though it had responded, it had not done so in the same way as the others. Harry bent closer to the blood samples and looked at them too. It was good to see he was taking an interest. At least that was someone, since a fortnight ago, Snape had either been too busy teaching to be able to work with her or on a mission with the Order. She had been lucky to secure even half an hour for him to carry out even the work in front of them, and even then he appeared quite put out. Not only that, it was Friday evening, 3 days before she was supposed to leave with a member of the Order to go to see Nick with the hair samples. In fact, it had been an almost imperceptibly quiet week that week. Tonks had flued her, but by the time she'd remembered to ask her whether she was the Order member, she had gone. There was little happening in the way of school activities. The students had been given far too much work, and she had observed long hours for many of them in the library. Professor Snobbits had told her he was working on an interpretation of the sigils and hieroglyphics in Pompops's notes, which had made her feel happy. They were progressing. Even the comments about her squibbishness had dropped to almost nothing, even from the Slytherins. And no one, not even Dumbledore, had challenged her over mysterious mythology. "They will do as they did last time," said Cecilia, looking at Harry. "That is to say, the mole one will be destroyed by your spell, the squib one will do nothing, and the wizard ones will respond. And your sample, Harry, will not respond in the same way, however there will be some change in the shape. However," she added, as Harry raised his wand, "it may be that, because you are who you are, Harry, the samples may respond differently to you compared to when Professor Snape did them. This is what I'm investigating with you." Harry looked across at Cecilia as she spoke, and for a moment she thought he was going to refuse. However, he raised his wand further, declaring "Ridicule," as silver sparks shot out of the end of his wand at the first sample. "Ridicule. Ridicule. Ridicule." Each time, he aimed at a sample, with the same spell. He looked at Cecilia. She shook her head, and gestured towards the microscope. Harry looked at her. "Me?" he said, a touch of edginess in his voice. "Really? Don't you want to look at them first?" Cecilia shook her head. "One of the first things to know about science, Harry, is that finding out things first, before anyone else, and be the first person in the world to have done it. Is good fun. Go ahead." She didn't have to offer again. Harry immediately collected the microscope from the shelf near the parapet and focused it as she had shown him before. "Good," she said, encouragingly. "Nice to see you remembered about the objective lens." She leaned forward from her perch on the bench next to Harry, watching the young boy look at the samples. "Good," she said again. "Now, I was wondering whether you would like to do something else for me, Harry." Harry looked at her quizzically. "My notebook," she said, showing him the next blank page. "I need to make a copy of these in order to record what they looked like. I don't suppose you'd like to dash?" "Oh, yeah," said Harry, excitedly. "I mean, yes please, Mrs. Frobisher." He took the book from her hand. "What do you want me to do?" He placed the book flat down on the desk beside the samples. "Where I drew the samples of the blood after Professor Snape used the same spell. They're here," she said, pointing towards the sketches. "If you could record please your name, the spell you used, and draw the samples please, in that column here." Cecilia pointed downwards at the empty spaces. "That would indeed help me out." No sooner as she'd asked him he'd begun, but it didn't take long for him to do it. He enchanted Cecilia's pencil to do the work. "Well done," said Cecilia, smiling. "If only I'd thought of that." Harry looked up and smiled too when he realized she was joking. "Are you going to be doing this type of thing when you go home, to the laboratory? Are you looking for this kind of thing?" She smiled, and opened the science textbook again, flipping past Einstein to the inheritance and selections section. "How much about genetics do you know, Harry?" It was one question she had avoided asking him until it was absolutely necessary, and even though she wasn't sure who would be going with her home from the order, she needed to be totally prepared. Not much, a little? Harry ventured, looking down slightly. Cecilia looked at him kindly. Harry, there's no need to feel embarrassed, she said as patiently as she could without sounding patronizing. You've been taught no science until this year, how are you possibly expected to know what it is? Even Professor Snape didn't know what it was until a few weeks ago, she added. That did the trick. Harry looked up, and whether it was the eagerness to learn something more or something more than Professor Snape, he asked Cecilia to explain. So she started off with the story of cells, referring to Harry's drawings, and asking him to think about what happened to them when people grew. She then managed to link into it gametes, and then took him into the cell itself, describing the chromosomes and then the genes in the nucleus, about the proteins that were so small they couldn't be seen by a microscope. Then imagine, you've been given 4 different cards, she said, laying out 4 different colored pieces of paper in front of her which she had found in the Mole Studies classroom. How many different ways could you arrange these in pairs? Within a couple of minutes Harry had determined there were 6 possibilities. So there are 6. Now imagine there are thousands and thousands of possible permutations of 6, all strung together in pairs. How many more chances are there of repeating a pattern? Don't forget these can line up anywhere. Harry picked up his wand and began to arrange the cards this time. After about 5 minutes or so of eager concentration, he began to look disconcerted. Well, he began, looking between the cards and Cecilia. You could have thousands, couldn't you? He grinned, realizing what she'd done. Billions, said Cecilia, quietly. Because here, she gestured towards Harry's assembly of protein molecules, is just one strand inside the chromosome, and here are thousands of strands. So they all could contain 1,000 possibilities each, said Harry. Wow, he added, looking back at the card. It's amazing. It is, said Cecilia, a little glowing coal of pride in her stomach. Each cell in a person's body contains their unique permutation of DNA. Each hair cell has the same arrangement to another, as does a skin cell to another skin cell. All the same code. Nature is simply marvelous in its simplicity. Anyway, she continued. Harry, what do you think that means? She continued, hoping he could move on his thinking. If we have thousands of different possibilities and thousands of strands, if they all contain proteins and they all tell our cells what to do and what to be? We're different, said Harry. We all look different. She nodded. Perhaps she was getting a little too advanced now. The proteins that are in your cells, Harry, have come from your parents. Mine have come from my parents. She gestured to a picture of King William IV, whose portrait inexplicably hung in the Mole Studies classroom. And his, from his, she added. Families are interrelated. There are certain places in the strands. She moved part of Harry's card model away from the rest, that occurs in people who are related, brothers, uncles, sisters, cousins. Aunts. She paused, waiting for him to catch on. If you take away what is known, which the tests I am to get done allow, then you can see what is not known. He looked back at her blankly. Cecilia sat on the bench next to the samples, feet on the back of one of the stools. Harry stared back, blankly. The more information I have about your family, from what you can tell me, and physically, the more of an understanding I can gain about you. From the information, we can then use it to make a spell or potion powerful enough to beat Voldemort, or at least, rid him of the opportunity to harm anyone again. But she's horrible, shouted back Harry to a slightly startled Cecilia. She used to call me strange and weird to my face, even when I was very young. She hated me, hated the fact she had been left with me. Everyone knows that she hated Mum, and Dad, too. Why did they leave you with her? Harry stared at her, eyes narrowing, as much as to say, you know perfectly well why. Cecilia looked back. Because she was Mum's sister, Harry continued, when Cecilia had said nothing. They didn't want to leave me with a wizard family. When she still didn't say anything, he continued, with a mole family, I'd be safer. Moments passed. Cecilia looked at Harry, a young boy in front of her. Harry returned the look, an adult woman who didn't actually know the true meaning of what he was saying. She's supposed to be my family, said Harry, eventually. They all are. And for 10 years of my life I was treated as if I had to earn the right to be there. He turned from Cecilia, who remained where she was. A channel to let it all out, she thought. Let it out, Harry, she thought, as his shoulders moved with his sobs. I'm no one of consequence. Eventually he turned back. Who is getting the sample? He asked, wiping away the remains of once hot tears. Whoever is leaving with me so we can get the tests done. A member of the Order, though I don't know who, yet. Harry sighed, and looked at Cecilia almost pleading that she would not continue to question him if he spoke. Dumbledore left me with her because she was Mum's sister. There was something about her being Mum's sister that's important. It would be good to know what it is. To know that it was worth it. Cecilia got to her feet. That you're here, Harry, still alive, that's got to be worth it. If you take away the magic, you can see what's left, and to me that looks like an awful lot of love, caring and respect. Anyway, she said, picking up the books and crossing the floor to replace them as Harry stood there, still looking at his feet. You've managed to do a fantastic job with my notebook, she added. When I'm at a particularly tricky part, at 2:45 of the morning and I need a spare pair of hands, I know who to call for their artistic talents. Anything else, Mrs. Frobisher? Asked Harry, looking up. Only I said I'd help Ron practice Quidditch. He's determined to be on the team this year. Cecilia nodded as Harry turned to go. Perhaps you'll come and watch when we play again, Mrs. Frobisher? You came before, and sat with the Professor McGonagall. Next week we're playing Slytherin. Perhaps, said Cecilia thoughtfully, although which team to support, that will be the difficult. Harry frowned, as if it should have been obvious. I will have to consider the capabilities of both teams, to be sure to make a fair assessment, she began, as Harry continued to frown. Tell me, Harry, between the two, has Gryffindor or Slytherin won the most games? Slytherin, replied Harry, reluctantly. And overall, of the other 4 houses? Slytherin. And you play for Gryffindor? Seeker, he nodded. And Draco Malfoy. Seeker. For the Slytherin team? He nodded slowly. Well, she continued solemnly. I think through careful examination of the facts, Harry, and you must understand I have concluded in a scientific manner, then the only team I could consider supporting would be Slytherin. Harry gave her a look that would have rivaled that of Molly Weasley. So, continued Cecilia, smiling broadly, when the match is held, I'll be sure to be sitting with Gryffindor House. And now, she said as Harry broke into a smile, enjoy the rest of the evening. You've worked well and I thank you. And now I need to think how energy plays a part in all this, Cecilia thought, as Harry left the Mole Studies classroom. She looked down at her lab book. The drawings were awfully good, and not for the first time. Cecilia considered whether talents and skills, such as drawing, were personal to the wizard and that magic was just a medium through which they were expressed. In the same way as if she was the most powerful witch in the world, she still wouldn't be able to sing. Though her acting abilities, which had allowed Harry to vent his feelings in the most restrained way possible, were entirely her own. It would have been much better if Snape had been able to work with them. She could have discussed the function of some of the cell organelles, which she was sure had something to do with the energy in wizard cells. Perhaps they could develop the social factor too, the one of which he had been keen to appraise her. Never mind, thought Cecilia, turning to her research notebook. He plainly has his reasons. She looked down at the space beneath her last sentence and, pausing to collect her thoughts, began to write. 88,888,888. Earth to Cecilia Frobisher, come in. SHRK. Cecilia looked up. The failing light in the classroom made her shiver, and she got up, book still in hand, to light the old-fashioned Victorian-style street lamps that were fixed to the wall. SHRK. It's life, but not as we know it. Cecilia looked round. Sirius. She yelped, when she saw his head in the fireplace. You scared the living daylights out of me. Hard at work, I see. He continued to grin at her surprise at seeing him, and nodded towards her notebook. She frowned. How come Sirius was here? How did he know where she was? And why was he popping in unannounced? I'd hardly still be in the Mul Studies classroom at 10:30 on a Friday evening if I was relaxing, would I? I don't know, retorted Sirius cheekily. They say muls have strange ways. For all I know, you take your work with you to bed. Did you want something? Cecilia had sat down on the bench near the large open fireplace. It was strange seeing Sirius again. She'd last spoken to him almost a fortnight ago. She'd let out her feelings to him about mysterious mythology, about the break-in. He'd been sympathetic. It was good talking to him though laced with impertinence. He usually had something interesting to say, but just now she wasn't in the mood for him winding her up. But she wouldn't tell him to go, either. Dumbledore said a person from the Order would be in touch about you going away, he said, still smiling. No, thought Cecilia, alarmed. Not you, Sirius. I'm not sure I could tolerate your distracting ways when I'm trying to work. I'm not sure you, she began, but stopped. He was still a wanted man. He couldn't leave Grimmauld Place, could he? Not you? Sirius shook his head. I think it's Tonks. I spoke to her today. She was going on about how it was great to see the other side. Couldn't wait to see what a Villitigian was. Cecilia chuckled inwardly. If it's on my cousin's mind, it's on her lips. Well, I know which side of the family that comes from, said Cecilia, provocatively, unless she gets it from her father, in which case it's pure coincidence. What's that, Mrs. Frobisher? He said, a hint of mischief in his eye. And I thought you were kind-hearted. If I didn't know better, I'd just think you were a callous, unfeeling, cold, and sensitive woman. What makes you think you do know better? Cecilia asked, playing along now out of defense. Maybe I am, and you don't know? Well, I did spend a night with you, Cecilia, and I consider myself a good judge of character. Maybe you should reevaluate what you used to base your judgment, Sirius, for I am just as you described, cold-hearted and callous. It was a little unfair. She had started it. But now Cecilia changed her tone to at least attempt to show she was now wresting control of the conversation that could so easily slip off to somewhere she didn't want to go. Now, other than stopping me working on the most important piece of research so far and making me jump out of my skin, is there any reason other than the possibility that Tonks may be coming with me that caused you to interrupt? She folded her arms and looked slightly indignant. See how you are, check you're okay, said Sirius, his tone changing from cheeky playfulness to solemnity. To make sure everything's going well. Is it? Cecilia stopped. Everything's marvelous, Sirius. I'll be going home in a few days' time. It couldn't be better. I'm glad to hear that, Cecilia, because last time I spoke to you, you were down because of your room and mysterious mythology. Cecilia thought back. She'd been crying, she remembered, then she'd remembered the letter, and had watched Sirius's head appear ghostly in front of her in the fireplace. I got it back, she said simply, then wondered why she had felt the need to justify herself. and Minerva helped me tidy up. Thank you for caring. Is everything else okay at Hogwarts? Harry not playing you up too much? The children? Snidot Snape. No, everything's fine. I'm making way on the work. I've got all but one hair sample. She stopped and glanced at Sirius momentarily before continuing, wondering why he would mention Snape and an image of their younger selves before Dumbledore from Minerva's memory came to the forefront of her mind. The science is progressing, she said simply. We're making more and more connections. That's good, Cecilia, really. Long term, it's going to be best for all of us. It's just wizards tend to get stuck in our ways a bit, hard for us to think laterally, I suppose. Makes sense, said Cecilia, thoughtfully. I think it's because you do have magic, Sirius. Because you know it and use it in addition to other things. She stopped, not least because she realized whom she was addressing and hadn't quite got over his limit of conception comment. Work stuff, she added. Sorry. Don't you think of anything other than work? Hardly. The sooner I can get this done for the Order and Professor Dumbledore, the sooner I can go home for good. Severus can take over and make the potion. She almost added, if he ever takes the time and trouble to understand this, it'll be quicker, but stopped herself in time. There is no way she wanted to get amongst an old feud tonight. Back to your lovely house and life, said Sirius. 2 cats in the yard and all that. Cecilia stopped herself again from saying something caustic defensively, as she recalled the comment she remembered Snape making to Moody all those months ago. Something like that, yes. Hadn't given it much thought, though it would be great to see my family again. Me too, he said, and there seemed to be a touch of sadness in his voice. My real family, he added. James, Remus, Peter, Lily, he stopped dead. My friends. Like in the old days. Like school, before all this. Cecilia got to her feet and moved closer to the fireplace. Your going away will help, won't it, Cecilia? He asked, almost imploringly, as if it up to her. Cecilia Frobisher, like a decision she was making, not an outcome, and she immediately felt guilty about being inciting earlier. We will know much more, Sirius. The science we will do is important and insightful. We will get a lot out of it. The aptitude of muggles, said Sirius softly, and added irreverently, what would we do without it? Are you insulting my intelligence, Mr. Black? Asked Cecilia, teacher-like, her mind flitting to the memory Minerva had shown her. His sport at Severus's expense, and a girl's. Like nothing more than a passing amusement. I wouldn't dare, Mrs. Frobisher, not your intelligence, grinned Sirius. Cecilia started to say something, then smiled to herself. Anyway, you can't go. Who would I have to speak to when I get bored? Who indeed, said Cecilia, stiffly. Who would you have to distract and annoy? Who would I have to rescue from perilous, life-threatening situations? Who would I have to? He stopped, just as images of him touching her cheek and pulling her closer filled her mind. She fought them out. Well, I think you'll have enough to do when Voldemort's gone and the wizard world changes. So if wizards really don't like change, then there's going to be a lot of unhappiness. She smiled. No, I think we'll all be able to cope. Anyway, I can see you're all right. I expect it will be Tonks. Dumbledore will really regret it otherwise. Cecilia smiled again. Right, I'm off. Got to leave you to your oh-so-important work. Yes, you must, said Cecilia, heart beating slightly faster despite the urgent warning in her head. Good night. 88,888,888. Cecilia continued with her work that weekend, engaging her contingency plan of collecting the information she needed that would inform NEC what resolution to set the genetic material analyzer. She had hoped Snape would meet her so they could again discuss work and had almost given up help until she received a note from Dumbledore informing her he needed to see them both that Saturday, at 5 p.m. Head buzzing as she worked out the most vital subjects to discuss, she was stopped in her tracks as she hurried from the library by Dobby, who presented her with another note as telling her that her presence was not necessary. It also added that the Order member who would accompany her would be in touch personally the next day. Turning pale, she returned to her room, wondering vaguely why she would receive 2 notes in such quick succession, but Dumbledore had just made an error, she concluded. In actual fact, however, she had been quite wrong to conclude that Dumbledore was engaged in a meeting. You wish her to abandon the work, Severus? This is most alarming. Dumbledore was pacing round his office, glancing periodically at Snape who was standing before him. Not in its entirety, Professor. However, I think it would be most unwise for her to leave Hogwarts. If I remember correctly, you came to me with Mrs. Frobisher a fortnight ago in order to vouch for her, and you were in full support and agreement. What has changed, Severus? If you recall, Headmaster, I raised the concern of her safety. A difficulty which was resolved by placing her in the care of an Order member. That they are aware of her presence at Hogwarts, or at least the presence of a squib called Elizabeth Mitchell, that is entirely to our benefit, as you yourself said, Severus, before Mrs. Frobisher joined us, that Voldemort and his followers would discover something of our plans. They bide their time, Headmaster. She probably will never be safe. Snape paced towards Dumbledore's desk, as if to appeal further, but stopped, and rubbed his left sleeve. Dumbledore watched him carefully before continuing. In that case, Severus, I cannot understand now the reason for your objection now, especially at such a late hour. The plan has formed as I imagined. The Death Eaters will await Voldemort's orders. Besides, Mrs. Frobisher has set cover work for her lessons tomorrow and Tonks is probably already with her. The Dark Lord, said Snape, looking at Dumbledore as he began to pace. As I explained. Severus, you confirmed that if Cecilia were to undertake the work herself here, it could take months. Is that now not the case? Snape stopped and stood there, silently. Then it is truly wrong for me to stop her when there is so much to gain, when there are few safety concerns, and it is a course of action that Cecilia herself believes to be correct. No, Severus. I don't believe what you have told me is a good enough reason to prevent her from leaving. However, her honesty. That she recovered the book that was taken from her, Remus Lupin's book. However crude the means, she believes in what she is doing, Severus, and that should be enough for you, especially with time pressing against us, such as it is. How is she to get there? Said Snape, folding his arms. It must be quick. If she is out of the grounds at Halloween, they will find her through the old magic. And if they find her, they will do all that is necessary to extract the information they require. That is under control, Severus. Rest assured, she is in good hands with Miss Tonks. They will be back on 30th. But sir, Dumbledore raised a hand. We have to allow Mrs. Frobisher a measure of freedom. She is her own person, Severus, we have seen this. In fact, I do not believe she would have been able to do this if she weren't dash. But dash. She will be in her own world, and back before you know it. As for the Death Eaters, I suspect from what you tell me they believe they are hunting the information they seek in the wrong place. I believe they will soon change tack, and that at least may buy us the chance we need. We have a strong card, even if we are not accustomed to her methods. We must play to our strengths. But last time, at home, with the book. Black. At his own mention of the name, Snape fell silent, glowering as he began to pace again. Sirius has seen the error of his ways as regards to Mrs. Frobisher, Severus. We must believe him. Very mysterious, given his views of moles, said Snape darkly. As is the reaction of your house, Severus. I believe they have, for reasons unknown, freed Mrs. Frobisher from taunts about her alleged parentage. He gave Snape a momentary look before continuing. No, concluded Dumbledore, rising from his chair and making his way over to Fawkes, who cawed in anticipation. I am quite decided, the benefits outweigh the risk, that is the simple truth. I will not prevent her leaving. 88,888,888. At the same time that Snape and Dumbledore were debating her departure, Cecilia was mourning the missed opportunities of the last month. Her hopes had flown high at the prospect of a meeting so as to gain Snape's opinion. Cecilia believed that it was down to the cell organelles, the bodies within the cells that performed specialized jobs, depending on the type of cell. What she thought was that they accommodated for the energy of the spell in some way, and informed the subject of the spell, mouse, toad, child in detention, to change in some way. And, she reasoned, there must be a secondary mechanism that controls it, some form of feedback, which meant hormones were probably involved somewhere. What she needed was his point of view, to see whether from his perspective this made sense, or indeed illogic. But this had not been possible since he had made no effort to contact Cecilia for a fortnight. As she prepared to leave, Cecilia made a mental note to discuss the subject of cells, genetics and endocrinology more closely with Nick. His biochemical background would probably shed a lot of light on Cecilia's mechanistic approach. He may even shed some light on the energy mystery, answers about which Cecilia knew would enable her to solve at least some part of the puzzle, which loomed tantalizingly out of her reach. No, she thought, as she paced round her room, what she actually needed was Snape to be there, to give her his unexpurgated views. Why had he barely spoken to her? Had he been avoiding the research because of what he'd told her? Did he regret talking about his pitiful childhood and his family? Had she not shown sufficient sympathy? Too much? Cecilia's mind ran through the possibilities. Was it the dark mark? The image of the hideous wheal on his left forearm appeared in Cecilia's mind, its presence parasitical, as if living upon his flesh. She rubbed her own arm, and shivered as she remembered her own recurring dream. No, she thought. It had to be something else, the order work of which she had little knowledge or wish to know. It would not be out of shame, she was certain, or he wouldn't have told her in the first place. Energy, she thought, shutting all other thoughts out of her mind. Cecilia opened her notebook again and sat on the bed. Was it silly to try to concentrate again when any moment now, someone from the order would make themselves known and she would be leaving? The words on the page didn't seem to make sense anymore. She looked at the page, checked and rechecked information, rewritten ideas, and interlinked and cross-referenced them for the last 2 days. She rubbed her eyes. Looking across at her overnight bag, which she'd packed and repacked countless times that day, she considered her indecision about what to take, removing parchment, adding clothes, removing clothes and adding the mole permit. Cecilia had come across it after the break-in, but despite the fact she was going home, she felt she couldn't be too careful, especially after what she had discovered about Draco Malfoy's father. Caution still should be borne in mind. Cecilia mentally scrutinized the contents of the bag again, and her eyes rested on the angular item that was causing her bag to become misshapen. Mysterious mythology. If Tonks was going to be her escort, she could ask her to give the book back to Remus. She had no real need to keep it now, and considering recent events it would be one less thing to worry about. Yes, she thought with satisfaction. Out of her care, no longer her precarious responsibility. Less reason for Draco Malfoy to take an interest. Looking away from her luggage and back at the fireplace, Cecilia wondered how they would be traveling. Hopefully not flew, she thought, glancing at the fireplace. Perhaps she'd be better off suggesting they caught the train? Just then, emerald flames crackled in the grate. Cecilia, said Remus Lupin, looking round him. Over here, she said, leaning forward from behind the wall. Since the break-in, she'd moved the room around with Dobby's help, and now the bed was no longer in full view of the fireplace. "Remus?" inquired Cecilia, peering round the chimney breast. She smiled briefly to herself when her eyes confirmed it was him. There, that was the right way to fool someone, not just appear. "Ready to go?" "Yes," she said, jumping off the bed. "So, you're the order member I've been waiting for?" "No, actually. Tunks is going with you, but I would rather like to go with her. I just came to ask whether that would be okay with you, Cecilia, as it's your house we will be at tonight." Cecilia stopped in the act of picking up her bag, and looked back at him. "Why, of course, Remus," she said, putting it down. Yes, certainly," she added. "Are you sure?" Yes, sorry. Yes, of course. I just wasn't expecting you to ask me that." She smiled. "That would be great. Where am I meeting her, do you know?" "There is a passage that leads from near the staff room, Cecilia. She informs me you know of it." Cecilia nodded, and Remus grinned. "Follow it into the grounds and I'll meet you there. Our transport will leave from Hogsmeade." "Okay, but do know how to get there on my own. You needn't." "I dare say you do, Cecilia, but I'd rather. It'd be a pleasure." 10 minutes later, and Cecilia was more than grateful that Remus had met her at the entrance to one of the most unsecret of secret passages. Despite packing the bare minimum, it still weighed heavy, and despite her initial refusal, he insisted on carrying it for her. They walked together towards Hogsmeade in the failing evening light, exchanging small talk as they went. Cecilia inquired after the health of the Order, Molly and Arthur Weasley and the others, Remus of her life at Hogwarts, the food, the ghosts, the nightly terrors that she had until then avoided. Most pleasant, thought Cecilia as the lights of Hogsmeade drew nearer, most civilized. Not like the last time she had crossed the grounds of Hogwarts, almost 3 weeks ago. While they walked, Cecilia took in Remus's appearance. She hadn't considered his age before. He had always seemed quite a lot older than herself, but tonight, as he paced out the steps next to her briskly and with ease, she considered he seemed more youthful, more animated and full of life. As the young man Remus appeared in her mind, she speculated to his having got over whatever illness had troubled him a few weeks ago. Cecilia considered mentioning mysterious mythology to him. Now he was going with them, and thought carefully about how to approach it. He had given it to her, and he'd probably know by now that it had been stolen. But she didn't need to keep it anymore. She didn't want it. The book was far too precious to be under her care. She had tried to return it countless times, she recalled, but each time a reason rose whereby it remained in her possession. Cecilia had tried to discuss that very subject with Sirius almost a fortnight ago, but it had come out all wrong. Now, as Remus recounted events at Hogwarts when he was a student there, describing Quidditch matches and subjects, Cecilia reconsidered raising the matter. Maybe there would be time tonight. She looked across at him as he talked and recalled the Remus from Minerva's memory, fair hair and down-to-earthness. So unlike Sirius. In the dark, she smiled to herself, glad to be in his company again, happy to be with him on her own, even for this short hour. As they neared the buildings in Hogsmeade, Cecilia wondered how they would be traveling. Maybe the reason she was to meet Tunks here was security, and they would be traveling by Floo from the Three Broomsticks. "She should be here," said Remus, as Cecilia scanned the streets. "I said past. "How are we to get there?" asked Cecilia. "You'll see." Just then, she heard footsteps hurrying towards them, and a figure dashed nearby. "Watcher," said the figure, addressing them. "Sorry about that, just got held up chatting to Rosie. Had to look incognito, didn't I?" she added, removing her hood. "But you're a metamorph," began Remus, but Tunks put her hand over his mouth. "Double bluff, see? If someone was looking for me, the last person they would expect to see would be me, because I'd be more likely to look like someone else than me. But if I am me, it couldn't possibly be me, see? She looked between Remus and Cecilia, imploring them to understand. Anyway, Sec, continued Tunks, don't you look great? It's been ages since I saw you. I see Remus was the perfect gentleman, she said, nodding towards her bag. Cecilia nodded back, and considered her appearance. Hair scraped back in a ponytail and clothes thrown on randomly, now slightly disheveled after their walk over the moorland between Hogwarts and Hogsmeade, and wondered upon what Tunks had based her nonetheless complimentary appraisal. You too, Tunks, said Cecilia. Right, she continued, changing the subject. Enough of this now. Is one of you going to tell me exactly how we're going to get home, or what? Remus looked at Tunks, who burst out laughing. Shall we tell her then? Remus said to Tunks, looking at Cecilia with mirth. I think we'd better, said Tunks as Cecilia folded her arms. Okay, Sec, enough with the guesswork. We're actually traveling by night bus. A night bus? Do you get them up here? I thought, only in London. No, silly, said Tunks, as she stuck out her arm. Cecilia went to take a step forward when a whoosh of air tore past her. The night bus. Watch it, yelled Remus, pulling Cecilia back by the shoulder as a purple triple-decker zoomed out of nowhere. Blimey, that was lucky, he added, smiling, helping her back to her feet. The last person who got run over by the night bus hasn't been seen since. Hole, added Tunks, smirking. Cecilia was just about to say something when a man appeared at the end of the bus. Tunks and Remus looked up at him. Lupin, said the man, in a distinct East End accent. He was dressed as an old-fashioned bus conductor in a uniform that was slightly too small for him, crossover straps and flat cap, as arranged. Anything for Professor Dumbledore, as well you know. Miss Tunks, he added, looking Tunks up and down as she frowned as being addressed as Miss. He held out his hand to help her on as Remus jumped on next to her with Cecilia's bag. And, he said, looking at Cecilia curiously. No, which she, he declared, looking at her further and with suspicion. This is wizard transport, Mull. I cannot allow you on. He folded his arms as if posing a one-man defense of wizard transport, frowning determinedly. She's with us, said Remus, glancing at Cecilia. Dumbledore, he added, winking at the conductor, and tapped his nose. The conductor looked back at Tunks and Remus. Then his face broke into a huge grin, and returned Remus's nose tap. What, he said, grinning and extending a hand in Cecilia's direction. Well, why didn't you say? He said, turning towards Remus. Yes, welcome aboard, miss. My name is Stan Shunpike. I am the night bus conductor for the evening. Cecilia smiled and took his hand, thinking how odd his introduction to her was, as if he had learned the dialogue from a script. Go through, he ushered, as Cecilia stopped, looking at the bus. There were 4 poster beds packed into the lower floor of the bus, all bedecked with drapes, and above were crystal chandeliers. She followed Remus and Tunks and, wondering where they were about to sit. Maybe the beds were comfortable in any case. It was a couple of 100 miles to get to Birmingham from their northerly location. Otherwise it wouldn't be that pleasant sitting for 3 or 4 hours on a bus. Just as she was about to sit on the nearest one, Stan turned to her. Not there, miss, he said quickly, moving her aside and looking at her severely. You was about to sit on Mr. Stand. Cecilia looked round, then back at Stan. But there's no one there, she began, then saw Remus and Tunks giggling between themselves. Mills, said Stan, shaking his head as if in despair as he approached the bed. Mr. Stand. Are you all right? Cecilia watched in amazement as the empty bedclothes moved and a man in an old-fashioned set of pajamas, carpet slippers and a nightcap sat up. "Are we there yet?" asked the man sleepily. "Not yet," said Stan, looking pointedly at Cecilia. "I was just warning you, like, as you was about to have been sat on." "All right," said the man, yawning. "Wake me up when we get to Dovetown." "So why couldn't I see him?" asked Cecilia, puzzled. "I realize this is all highly amusing," she added, looking between Tunks, Remus, and Stan. "Well," said Stan, ushering her near the front as he converted a couple of beds to a pair chintz-covered settees, "it's not every day a Mulhar Dash gets on the night bus, eh Ernie?" he said, addressing the driver. "Look," he said, conspiratorially, whispering to her loudly behind his hand, "them's beds the ... Our transport here, well, I have to admit it ain't what you'd call the most modern of transports." He gestured around, finishing by pointing at Ernie. "And Ernie, well," he continued, "he ain't the best driver, nva." He gestured to the beds. Cecilia followed his wave. "So, when you want to travel in the sleeping facilities, youse end up wanting to sleep." He grabbed hold of her as the night bus ground to a bone-jarring start, like the dead. Cecilia lurched forward as the bus began to move off. It whizzed across the grass, past the three broomsticks, and the scenery of Hogsmeade began to blur into the backdrop of the failing evening light. Stan let go of her and Cecilia sat down next to Tunks on one of the settees, giving her a quick frown in the direction of Stan. Tunks nodded back and grinned widely. Why couldn't they have flued? It didn't matter that she felt ill afterwards, it would have at least been less magical, or magic she knew. She glanced out of the window again, feeling slightly nauseous, and had a sneaking suspicion that they were not driving at all, but flying a few inches off the ground. "So," Cecilia said, glancing round the bus again. "How long will it take to get to Birmingham, then?" Remus opened his mouth to speak, but Stan turned as she spoke, sitting down on the arm of the other settee. "Oh, so it's Birmingham, eh? Down the M6? Dodgy place, some parts of it. And they say Shepherd's Bush is bad," he added, shaking his head. "Well, tonight we've got to drop off Mr. Stand, just at Dovetown, like he says, then we're all yours." "Thanks," said Cecilia, acknowledging Stan in the hope he would stop engaging her in conversation. "Don't mention it," he said, tapping his cap. "My law, no. It's always a pleasure to be of service." 88,888,888. An hour later and Cecilia opened the door of her house. Following a prolonged and complicated description of where she lived, Stan, in his wisdom as 30 years in the trade, man and warlock, had proceeded to drop them off a mile away. Despite their less than auspicious start, the journey in the night bus wasn't actually that bad. Admittedly, Cecilia had felt anxious the first dozen times Ernie had driven too close to oncoming traffic on A roads and motorways, but by the time they had been on top of them, the imminent and potentially terminal collisions had strangely but instantly disappeared. Cecilia, Tunks and Remus had chatted pleasantly together after Mr. Stand had departed. Cecilia had asked about Petunia Dursley's sample, and Tunks had taken out a hank of hair, dark brown flecked with grey, and winked conspiratorially. Cecilia had smiled back, thinking of the snow-white strands she had sandwiched between two sheets of parchment and stowed in her coat pocket earlier that evening, and the other, black and soft, Sirius's. Remus had then showed them both the samples he'd collected, which had been donated from various order members, and Tunks had given Petunia's to him. Cecilia had thought about asking for them now, but instead, brought out the third sample she had been carrying, Harry's, and Remus stowed the two. She had also brought up the subject of magic, and they had both agreed neither her nor Remus would perform any magic unless it was absolutely necessary. As the night bus had approached the Midlands, Tunks asked Cecilia about her house. She had described it in detail, relishing with anticipation the home comforts that awaited her, but as they stepped in through the front door, The warm cozy environment she had expressed was worlds away from the clutter and disorder that welcomed her. Now, as Cecilia showed them both through the front door, her description of House Beautiful fell somewhat short of the mark. "Amy," called Cecilia as she switched on the hall light. Shoes, piles of papers and letters festooned the hall, and she ushered in Tunks and Remus, feeling more than slightly embarrassed by the state of things. "Amy," she called again stridently, as she surveyed the house again. "Are you in?" "Who's Amy?" said Tunks, looking at Cecilia as she took her eyes off the pile of bags and coats bedecking the stairs. "My sister," said Cecilia loudly, as she strode purposefully into the living room, surveying a similar sight within, and then into the kitchen. "Bloody mess," she added, then looked at Remus and Tunks, who had followed her in. "Sorry," she added, smiling weakly at them. "Tea?" she asked, making her way over to the sink. "If she's left anything clean, of course." "I take it your house doesn't usually look like this," said Remus, trying unsuccessfully to hide a smile. "Hardly," said Cecilia, running water from the tap into the sink and glancing exasperated at the pile of dirty crockery and cutlery awaiting washing. "No hot water, just a second," she added, turning to the central heating switch, then sighed. Amy'd let the boiler go out. Remus and Tunks exchanged bemused looks. "Why don't you just sit down?" said Tunks, quietly. "It'll take us the shake of a dragon's tail to get this place how you like it." "I don't think," Cecilia began, then stopped. She felt exhausted, and coming back to her house in such a mess hadn't helped matters. Sinking back into one of her kitchen chairs, she nodded gratefully, deciding this was an absolutely necessary situation. Tunks nodded at Remus, and 5 minutes later Cecilia glanced round her neat and tidy home. "Home," she thought, as she made the tea. "How good it is to see you." She expressed the sentiment to her bricks and mortar before turning and thanking them both. "Don't mention it," said Tunks, cheerily, "although I must say I can't remember ever seeing so much post." She handed Cecilia a huge pile of letters, some a couple of months old and some, Cecilia noticed with dismay, were bills. "Anyway, as I was about to say as we came in, welcome, and if there's anything I can get for you whilst you're here, don't hesitate. Just help yourselves to anything you need. Or just ask if there's anything you're unsure about," she added, her mind beginning to fill with 1001 situations which they, as wizards, may find difficult. "We will," said Remus, smiling at Tunks. "So what is the plan for tomorrow?" "I'll call Nick in a while, and make sure everything's fine. We'll have to be up at 3 so we can get to the lab in time, okay?" "3?" said Tunks in alarm. "What time is it now?" 9:15, said Cecilia. "Don't worry, Tunks. I'll get the beds made up in a little while, plenty of time for your beauty sleep." Remus smiled and Tunks pulled a face at him. "I'll show you up," Cecilia continued, putting down her cup and getting to her feet. Remus stood up too, but Tunks remained where she was.